Okay. Hi, guys. Welcome to our first speaker series workshop. Um, we can start in a couple of minutes. We are still waiting a few people. Meanwhile, let me introduce myself. I'm Azra. I'm the coordinator of language barrier. One of the main parts of the Youth for Success. I'm also the team leader of Language Barrier, and I'm here on behalf of the Language Barrier team. Before we start, I just want to remind you that we are going to have a question and answer section at the end of our workshop. So if you have any questions, please keep them to yourself until at the end of the workshop, so that you can ask all your questions to our guest speaker. Okay. Once again, oh, great, okay. Once again, I'm happy to see you all in our first speaker series workshop. We are so excited to see you all here. I would like to now invite our guest speaker, Kirsch, who is going to talk about what is language barriers, and so on. But I want to remind you that we are going to have a question and answer section at the end of our workshops. So please ask your questions at that section and wait until the presentation over. Hi, Kirsch. We can't
Hi,
hear
Azra.
you.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. First, let me share my screen before I start. I hope that it is shared now in full screen mode. Is it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Should I start now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I would just wanted to say thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to be presenting at this workshop for this wonderful organization. It's so great to hear that there are such organizations being held and moved on with these fantastic volunteers. This is great. This is what we need for the improvement of our society, specifically for the improvement and raising the awareness for the younger students and young adults. Today, I will be talking about language barrier. I will be mostly talking about social and cultural factors that induce language barriers, stigmas, negative attitudes, and negative stereotypes. And at the end, I will present some resolution strategies and methods in order to overcome language barrier. Here's the roadmap of my presentation. First, I'll start with the introduction of language barrier, the definition of language, origin of language, languages in the world, and how they contact. Finally, I'll talk about the dominance of some languages over others, and of course, the barrier that appears after that. Finally, At the end, I will talk about the strategies that we can have in order to overcome language barrier. Okay. The first question that we have to ask for this presentation is the definition of language barrier. In definition, language barrier is a barrier which limits or completely blocks the communication between people who are unable to speak the same language. Of course, there are different levels of language barrier. For some contexts, there might be no communication, which means complete blockage of communication, which is complete language barrier. And of course, there are lower and lesser degrees of barrier. There are different factors that cause language barrier. The two known factors, probably most known ones, are lack of proficiency to speak the languages of the contact that are used, and the other one are the social and cultural factors. The focus of today's talk is on the social and cultural factors that cause language barrier. The main reason that I chose this specific topic is that there is less known factors at play about the sociocultural induced language barrier. On the other hand, there are more resources about the factors that cause language barrier based on lack of proficiency in use of a language. For example, one might know that they have language barrier due to lack of enough proficiency or fluency in a certain language. Tonight, I'll be using a lot of examples based on a country like Canada, in which the official languages are English and French, and I will keep using Canadian context to be able better to show what I mean. So imagine that somebody who doesn't speak English fluently or is not completely proficient has an issue of language barrier, and the path is clear for them. They know that they have to, for instance, work on their speaking or on their listening, and there is a way that you can mitigate those issues. However, sociocultural factors that cause language barriers are lesser known, they are subtler, and they are more internalized, unfortunately. So I chose this topic intentionally in order to touch on a language barrier factor that is lesser known, and it is internalized more inside the society at a very subconscious level. However, we can talk about the foreign language learning methods of overcoming language barrier during the Q&A session. So we can talk about and cover that as well. Anyway, first we need to know what language is to know the barriers to the language. What is language? Simply, language is a communication system which includes subsystems of sounds, words, phrases, and sentences. And of course, language is the main and principal means of communication among humans. When we talk about language, one of the most important questions that has been the concern of not only linguists, but also anthropologists, even biologists, archaeologists, so on and so forth, is that what is the origin of human language? The fundamental challenge with regard to the investigation of language evolution is the lack of sufficient evidence. Why? Because spoken languages do not leave fossils, as you know. And during the course of human language evolution, writing began much, much later than speaking. So humans began learning how to start speaking way earlier than the writing systems began. And obviously, fossil skulls do not tell us what the brains could do in terms of the faculty of language. So there is this mystery that may not be ever resolved, but we are hopeful that we can find some traces. The only reliable evidence is the shape of human vocal tract, which includes mouth, tongue, throat, and any articulatory system that we have. And based on this, until anatomically modern humans, which is around 100,000 years ago, the shape of our vocal tract didn't permit the modern range of speech sounds that we use across different languages in the world now. However, we should be cautious about this. This postulation doesn't necessarily entail that languages began then. Probably earlier hominids could have had a language with a more restricted range of sounds. So there should have been languages, but the sound system and the number of the sounds and the range of the sounds were much more limited. What are the distinct features of human language? First of all, no other communication system on this planet is the same as human language. Why? Because every human language includes tens of thousands of words and several dozens of speech sounds. Speakers of all languages can build an unlimited number of phrases and sentences. And importantly, every normal child remarkably learns the whole system of a language from hearing others use it. And we as humans, by use of human language, can express thoughts on different topics, such as science, literature, incidents, emotions, anything related to time, not only about the current time, the synchronous time, the present time, but also about the time that has already passed or the time that has not come yet. We can negate things, we can ask questions, make orders and statements. On the other hand, animal communication systems have a very few limited distinct calls, and that's mostly for communication of immediate issues such as food, danger, and threat. And when we have this comparison, one might ask whether all human languages have all these capabilities, or are there languages which might have more advanced linguistic mechanisms and tools? The very short answer is that all human languages are all equal in this regard. All languages are equally capable of creating infinite number of sentences on infinite number of topics. And this is an important point, and I will be talking about this again. Now, given that we have briefly touched on the definition of the language, I want to very quickly talk about languages in the world. It is very astonishing to say that currently there are more than 7,000 living languages around the world, such as Turkish, Swahili, Inuktitut, Kurdish, and besides all these sign languages, like American Sign Language, Arabic Sign Language, Persian Sign Language, Mexican Sign Language, so on and so forth. And as an important point, sign languages, the same as the other languages, are all complete linguistic entities which are perfect to make human communication. So sign languages are as complete as human languages, as other human languages. And here's a distribution of the human languages in the world. Every circle shows one language, and you could see that in some parts of the world, languages are more dense. There are denser areas, and there are some parts that we have very wide areas with only limited number of the languages. But the important point here is that as of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, we have more than 7,000 living languages. So with such diversity, with such fabulous language diversity, language contact becomes inevitable. And obviously, not all languages are equally in contact with one another. Of course, there are various factors that cause language contact. Some of them are geographical factors, religion, history, industry, politics, or anything that can cause languages bring closer to one another or further distinct from one another and further apart from each other. In terms of the number of the speakers, languages are not equally distributed in the world. Out of these more than 7,000 languages, there are only about 40 languages that are endangered. So there are 40% of languages that are endangered, and they have less than 1,000 speakers left. On the other hand, half of the world's population speaks 23 languages. So let's revisit that again. There are more than 7,000 languages. Around half of the world's languages are dying. They are on the verge of extinction. And meanwhile, there are 23 languages that can account for half of the world's population. So that's what I mean by saying that, well, there is not an equal distribution of languages across speakers in the world. And here is a map, here's a bar plot showing top 10 most spoken languages in the world. On the x-axis, on the horizontal line, we have the number of the speakers, and on the y-axis or in the vertical line, we have the name of the languages. So yeah, that's an indication showing that how languages are distributed in the world. Now that we have learned about number of the languages, language contact, and the number of the speakers in the world, we can say that languages are not just in contact with each other. Some languages become more dominant due to several factors, such as political reasons, social factors, religion, uh, historical incidents, so on and so forth. And then when we have some languages that are becoming more prevalent, becoming more dominant, there's this question that what happens after that? In some societies, we will be encountering uh, something called the dichotomy of languages, in a sense that in one country, one language becomes the prestige language or it becomes the dominant language versus the other languages. For example, in country X, there are 10 languages, but among those 10 languages, just one of them becomes the most prestigious language or becomes the most dominant one, which is pretty much common across those countries that are multilingual. When we have such a dichotomy of prestige language versus other languages, it is very much possible to see that we are prescribed quite subconsciously or consciously that one language becomes more prestigious in a way that we are kind of internalized with this idea that if we speak such a language, it is more prestigious, it is more celebrated. And then we are prescribed that one dialect is more prestigious than the other dialects of the same language. So we see that everything becomes narrowed down gradually. We have a multilingual nation. Among those multilingual nations, one language becomes the most dominant one. And then across all the different dialects of the same language, one becomes the most important or the most prestigious one. And after that, it is prescribed how to say things in their correct way. And that correct way means the way that this very limited minority speakers of the prestige dialect of the prestige language speak. Given this, we have to ask a few questions. First of all, does it have a scientific basis to have a prestigious language versus other languages? We already talked about this. Aren't all languages equal? If so, why should one language or dialect be more prestigious and not the others? Who has established the correct form versus incorrect forms of saying things or speaking? And since when did these rules apply? When did they apply and who applied them? Are they carved in stone? Were they always like this and should they always be like that? To briefly touch on the answers of these questions, first of all, we talked about it. All languages are equal. They are all complete linguistic entities, so there is no reason for hierarchical categorization of the languages from the most prestigious to the least. Second, talking about correct versus incorrect form in its prescriptivist terms makes language to be forced to freeze, to stand still. However, language is always in change. Language change and evolution is always inevitable. It's not something that we can control it. Language will never stand still. And on the other hand, prescriptivism wants to cage language and make it stand still. And importantly, there is no such thing as correct versus incorrect prescription, because the only criterion is all speakers of a language, not the prescriptivists who say how to say things or how not to say things. This is a crucial point that we have to all be careful about. When we're talking about language, we have to talk about all the speakers of a language, because all the speakers, regardless of their age, gender, profession, level of education, place of birth, their socioeconomic status in the society, are the speakers of language. And they are the ones who say if something is okay to say in a language, if something is acceptable in a language or not. And not the prescriptivists who sit on an armchair and try to dictate how to say things. Now that we have talked about the dominance of the language very briefly, one might ask, so what? Why should I care? And how does this affect the dominance of a language over other languages would affect us? Well, when we have this hierarchical categorization, just imagine a pyramid when we have one language on top as the most celebrated, most prestigious one versus everything else. Non-prestige languages and dialects become isolated gradually, and they become degraded and become ignored. And after that, as a result, we will see that the speakers of those non-prestige languages or dialects gradually become marginalized. And when the speakers of a certain language or dialect, they become marginalized, they become ignored, their communities become ignored. And after that, subsequently, we will see that within those marginalized communities, again, we have the marginalization of speakers of the same marginalized community. Because, for example, again, in Canada, if a community that is not the majority in Canada speaks several dialects of a language, again, the same thing that happened to that marginalized community versus the nationwide comparison would happen for that marginalized community. So we will have a community that is marginalized, and there are some communities at the micro level that are marginalized inside that community. And at the end, this causes a lack of communication across different communities in a society, because we gradually see that there is a prestige language or dialect that is becoming more and more prevalent, and usually and gradually the other dialects, the diverse ones, become more and more ignored. And ignorance and lack of communication results in the segregation of different parts of a community. As a result, we will see that stigmas against speakers of non-prestige languages and dialects will be risen. And this is very much common in multilingual or multicultural communities when we have stigmas against the non-prestige speakers, the minorities as well. And this intensifies negative stereotypes that inhibit cross-community communications. At the end, what we see is that people get labeled by their language or dialect easily, which is a overgeneralization towards a great population of speakers only based on their communities. And the final thing that we are facing is a society that includes islands of unreachable communities, because as I said earlier, there is one prestige form, there is one prestige language, and as a result, there is one prestige community. While that community is enjoying this prestige, others become less and less known. They go to the marginal parts of the society, they lose different opportunities. And when the marginalized communities lose different opportunities, subsequently we will have a lack of communication across different communities, because communities prefer than remain into their own bubble of their own people. And given all this, we will be facing a socioculturally induced language barrier. Well, why? Because one might have learned to be a fluent speaker of a dominant or prestigious language, or one even might be a fluent speaker of a dominant or prestigious language, but due to not being part of the prestige community, they might feel unfit for the society. This is a thing that can happen to specifically international students and children of immigrant families. Because there are lots of cases that we see that students from different parts of the world go to a country, for instance, again, like in Canada, they might be completely proficient in English or French or both, yet they may not still feel that they can communicate easily. They might see the language barrier. And this is the point that I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. When we have this context, the situation that the speaker that a person is speaking completely fluently, like a language like English or French or both, yet there is still that language barrier in front of them that blocks them to communicate with people, to find opportunities for them at the university level, at high school level, or at any level for the future job opportunities. Are raised here, like in Canada, they have no issue with their language proficiency. They have no issue with their fluency in English or French or both, Yet there is still this barrier, and the source of such a thing is that subtle marginalization based on those speakers' language and hence their communities. Now that we have kind of talked about language barriers that are caused by social and cultural factors, I thought this is a good idea to talk about some of the uh, ways to overcome these barriers. And I thought that we can categorize resolution strategies of the barriers at two levels of personal and social. First, I start with some suggestions of personal level. How to overcome barriers at the personal level for speakers with language barrier. First of all, we should understand that and accept that nobody chooses their parents, place of birth, and native language. And obviously, there is no reason to be ashamed of one's language, nor to be proud of it. This isn't something we chose. We have no control over it. And importantly and remarkably, all languages are equal. And as we talked about it, we can use any language, pick any language out of these 7,000 languages, irrespective of the number of the speakers. They're all equal. So there is nothing wrong with our language. And we should accept and embrace our language and cultural background. Because one's language is a heritage, so it should be cherished. In the field of linguistics, for instance, immigrants' children are called the heritage speakers. And that is why, because we as linguists consider language as a heritage that has been handed down from the parents to these children, and it should be handed down to the others as well. Language is a heritage, it's a legacy, because languages are corridors or gates towards civilizations. Unlike what is usually heard, that if one speaks a language other than the dominant language is kind of a shame, I think they should be happy because they know one language more than the others. They know at least one language, and they, via that language, know so many things. They can communicate with so many other people who speak the same language. They can have access to cultural, linguistic, literary, and anything background that is related to a community that uses that language. And after understanding this point, we have to stand against these negative stereotypes. One of the most common negative stereotypes is that speaking with an accent means that one knows, well, it's something not positive to speak, like, for instance, English or French with an accent. On the other hand, speaking with an accent means that one knows at least one more language. So whenever I hear that somebody is speaking like French, English, or any other language, but they are using a kind of an accent, I get triggered and I get excited that, oh, this person knows at least one more language, and this is fabulous because that language, knowing that language means that person knows so many things about the speakers of that language probably, and the cultural things that are related to that language. We need to internalize that languages are gates towards civilizations. In addition to that, we need to understand that the stigmas against such things like speaking with an accent have no scientific basis. They have no scientific basis because they are just brought up randomly for no good reason. Besides all these, we need to improve our language proficiency skills and communication abilities. Why? Because again, in a country like Canada, if we are part of a marginalized community with language barrier, we need to outreach. We need to talk about this issue with other people who are outside of our comfort zone, who are outside of our community. And to do that, we need to use the majority's language, which is here, for instance, English or French. And we have to learn how to communicate skillfully in order to be effective and positive, so that we can bridge between the marginalized and the non-marginalized communities. Besides, it is also the responsibility of the non-marginalized community to find mitigation strategies of the barrier. So it cannot be something one-sided. It should be from different parts and different angles. I suggest that people without the barrier from the prestige communities or the non-marginalized communities need to try to be more inclusive toward the marginalized communities. They need to use the common language in a more understandable way for non-native speakers and marginalized communities. Also, They need to outreach in their own communities and raise awareness about the negative effects of sociocultural isolation of the communities at a very big or macro level. In other words, when we have this language barrier across different communities in a society, at the end of the day, this marginalization of a specific group of society results in deterioration of the whole society. Not only does it affect that specific community that is marginalized, but it also negatively influences all members of the society, irrespective of being marginalized or non-marginalized. Now that we've talked about this overcoming strategies at personal level, I have some suggestions how to overcome these barriers at social level. After internalizing those factors personally, I think it is time to act. It is time to reach out to people and specifically to students, to young adults and adult students who are more vulnerable in this case, because students are more in contact, they are lesser informed, and they are very much young, and there could be some negative effects on them because of these language barriers that could remain with them till the end of their lives. So it is important to reach out to the students and teach them how to know the issue of language barrier and the strategies to overcome them. Importantly, we need to raise awareness for language equity. The thing that I mentioned earlier, and I said this is an important point. Languages are all equal. All dialects of the same language should be respected equally. There is no difference between them, and we have to show that to everybody and raise awareness about it. Of course, we're living in a strange time. Everything has become virtual now, so we should use this opportunity. You can use social media to raise awareness and speak up about this language equity and making people aware about it. We need to hold workshops and symposiums and conferences across different communities to talk about different issues like language barrier and mitigation strategies. And of course, we need to hold discussion groups like in a more interactive way for different groups of society. And that's very helpful because we will be talking in person with people. They can share their experiences. There might be some things that may be common among people. Some things may not be. And that's a good way of finding the weak points of how we can find the strategies to work better. And one other important thing is that we shouldn't forget about our loved ones, like our family members and our friends, because when we hold workshops and symposiums, sometimes we forget about our family members, and we need to tell them to make awareness about this and tell them about these stigmas, these negative stereotypes, and their harms to everyone else. And at the end, I think that like any other fundamental change, it has to start from every single one of us. And it has to move on steadily, though it may not be that much fast. And it won't happen overnight, but it will happen eventually. Because if we start from ourselves and then try to reach out gradually, steadily, we can make some changes. I would like to finish my talk with a personal example. I am a very good example of language barrier because I was born and raised with two languages. So technically I'm called a simultaneous bilingual speaker. I can speak two languages natively. And I can speak Persian and Kurdish like a native. I'm a native speaker of both of them. But the point here is that I'm a native speaker of a dialect of Kurdish, which is marginalized in its own community. And at the same time, I'm a native speaker of a dialect of Persian, which is marginalized in that other community. So you could see that if I wanted to switch between these two languages, there should have been some language barriers anytime I used either of the languages. And that was the case. I felt sometimes like that I can't talk easily. And that's where that I'm talking about the more kind of a subtle danger of socioculturally induced language barrier. Because as a case study, my example was that, well, I'm the native speaker of both languages. So why is it difficult for me to speak out? Why is it difficult for me to communicate? And the reason for that was that there were some negative stereotypes and stigmas against the dialects that I spoke. So it was at a time that I had to decide what I should do. I thought about this and I read some stuff about language, linguistics, language barrier, and stuff like that. And I specified in the field of linguistics. And then I thought, oh, my dialect is no different from other dialects. The other dialect is not any inferior than the most prestigious one. So why should I be worried or shy? It didn't happen overnight, but when I changed my perception or my way of thinking towards the languages or the dialects that I spoke, I felt like that barrier gradually started to disappear in front of me. And that's where I could see the positive influence of it in me. I could see that when I'm in classroom, I feel like that it's okay that my dialect or the way that I spoke or the Persian the accented Persian or the accented Kurdish doesn't seem familiar to the others, but that's totally fine. My dialect is no different from others. And when after changing my perception and applying this new viewpoint, as I said, not only did this language barrier disappear, but I also could reach out to the other people and talk about this issue with those who had the same problem. That happened when I moved to the North America, because I speak English with an accent, which is a combo of Persian and Kurdish. Again, that kind of barrier appeared at the beginning. But when I revisited and I viewed everything from a very big bird's eye view, I could see that I can tell that, oh, this language barrier is coming up because my English is proficient enough to communicate with people. Yet I'm still feeling that shyness. I'm not confident enough to ask questions in classrooms or bring up points. And when I again changed my perception towards my accents, my language, and my cultural background, things were made very much easier for me. I could feel like that there is this change that's happening after I changed my perception. So I encourage everybody, if they are dealing with the same issue in the same situation, to revisit everything, ask the same questions that I asked from myself, and try to view whatever you are from an objective point of view. We are not different in terms of the way that we speak. We are speakers of the same language. As a case for me, I speak Persian with a different accent than the majority of the people in my home country, but there's no difference among us. So when we change our perception, we can change so many things. I would like to finish my talk with this quote from Einstein, which says that the world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, thank you. That was so great.
Thank you.
We have a few questions already from the audience. Just a quick reminder, you can always type your questions as well as you can raise your hand and we can allow you to speak. I believe you can see the questions, but I want to read the first one out loud. So I guess the audience are not able to see the questions.
Okay.
The first one is asking, why is it so much more harder to learn a language after a certain age? That's a really good point. And she gave an example. I have a younger sibling who was able to speak English within a month, and it took me 8 years to even understand the fundamentals of French. Why are kids so much more better at grasping a language than their adult counterparts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. There are so many researchers in the field of linguistics that, why does this happen? The short answer is that human cognitive systems, specifically the language faculty of humans, unfortunately grows to become slow as we age. There is a terminology that is there called critical age. We as humans have this fabulous ability of acquiring languages at earlier stages of our lives. And as I hinted to that in my presentation very earlier, I said that we remarkably learn languages and acquire them just by listening to others. But as we grow older, we lose this ability. And And that critical age is around age of 15. So when we pass that age, learning a language would become gradually harder and harder. So that's probably one of the reasons that when you have a younger sibling who's much younger than you, quickly picks up a language, takes it up, and can be easily using it. But when we pass a certain age, we gradually lose that ability. We don't completely lose it, but learning a language becomes harder and harder. I hope that I have addressed your question.
Yeah, we have a second question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It asks, do you think that software such as Duolingo works when it comes to learning a new language? I think they're addressing like apps that helps to learn languages, and they helps to practice a lot and daily.
I think it's always good to be updated and use different methodologies and ways to learn a language. However, we should be careful about the use of these languages, these apps or systems, because they may not be exactly targeting the issue of our language learning process. Some people have challenges learning a certain skill like speaking. And some of these apps are not that much smart enough to gear towards what we cannot understand or we cannot learn well. So I suggest that these are good apps and we can use them, but at first point, we need to diagnose what we are unable to learn via a kind of a sophisticated and educated instructor, and then try to use these apps.
Okay, so before I get to the next question, I just wanted to again thank you on behalf of myself and on behalf of Youth for Success team for a very informative and insightful presentation.
Thank you.
That was very informative, actually. So the question is, why do language classes push so much when it comes to learning how the English language works? And why do they not focus on teaching students to speak it in favor of teaching students boring phrases that we'll never use?
Okay, I think I missed the question, so let me read it again.
Yeah,
Why do
sure.
language classes push so much when it comes to learning how the English language works? Why do they not focus on teaching students to speak it in favor of teaching students boring phrases and that they will never use? Yeah, if I've understood this correctly, well, there are new methodologies that are showing up very much frequently in the field of language learning, foreign language learning, second language learning, in order to make the learning process a fun as well as an informative one. But there are some outdated methodologies that might be boring for learners and make it very much tedious. And at the end, that results in not liking to learn the language, not liking to view it. And one very common example is that whatever my teacher in my English class teaches me just goes over my head, but whatever I learn from the movies or animated movies that I watch just goes into my head. And that's because while you're enjoying the animation, the animated movies, you're unconsciously, subconsciously learning something about it. So this is the issue that most of the foreign language educators are dealing with, how to make it fun specifically for the younger generations who are very much attached to their phones, how to use this opportunity to learn, to teach these students in a way that could be informative and at the same time constructive.
Yeah. And the next question is, oh, okay. How can I support a person who is struggling with a language barrier? For example, I have a friend who is suffering from lack of confidence because they think that they are not good enough to speak English and are too scared of making mistakes.
Yeah, this is very important, and we need to work on that more and more. This has roots in the stigmas that we are facing, probably much. Probably your friend doesn't feel like that they are good enough to speak up, and that's what lots of people are dealing with. I'm sure that some of us have had this experience, that we're in a classroom, we are thinking about a question to ask or a comment to make, but we feel like, oh no, this is not good enough to ask that, or this is not a good enough comment to make. But while we are trying to inhibit ourselves and block ourselves from speaking up, one other person in the same room asks the same question, and we get so many good feedback, and I say, oh, I should have said that. Why didn't I say that? And that's where we see the negative influence of socioculturally induced language barrier. We have to stand against these stigmas. While your friends should know that they don't have anything lesser than the others, others don't have anything more than us, at least in terms of our linguistic faculties. We all know how to, we as normal speakers of different languages perfectly speak languages well, and your friend is no different from anyone else. And let's think about the worst case scenario. Your friend makes a mistake, and then what else? I think everybody else makes mistakes. All of us make mistakes. So if your friend makes a mistake, then there is no problem with that. I probably have made some mistakes during my presentation. So that's okay. That's like a typo when you're typing something. It happens and it will happen. And there's nothing wrong with it.
And also, we can say that practicing makes everything normalized. So during your practices, maybe in an environment where he or she feels more confident and comfortable, as she makes mistakes, she will feel that this is normal and she can make mistakes. And as she goes into environments where she shares the same level of English or other languages, she will see that other people also make mistakes. And also it doesn't only depends on the your level or skills of language. People can make mistakes a lot when they're nervous or when they're excited. So they should also know that they should also recognize these facts when they're making mistakes and feel like less confident.
Yes, exactly. That's an important point. So
Okay,
these two should go in hand, learning and at the same time trying to build up on our own confidence. Thank you, Azra. That was a very good point.
Yeah, so next up, this is a very interesting question, and I'm very actually interested to hear your answer. So question is, some newcomers think the best way to learn is to forsake their own language and community. The further away they are from their own background, the better it is. However, it results in cultural losses, especially in next generations, reducing diversity in society. So what would be your advice as a best practice, best way to learn a new language?
Yeah, that's an important question, as you mentioned, Siad. There's this wrong belief that in order to learn a new language, you need to forget about whatever you know about your own native language or languages. They are not in contrast with one another. They are not mutually exclusive. You can have your own cultural background. You can keep your own language. You can be inclusive in your own community. And at the same time, learn a new language as well as a new culture. For example, in the field that I am mostly working in, which is the field of linguistics, there are so many people with different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Like me, they speak a variety of languages, and they are active in their own communities. And they try to learn new languages because, well, for linguists, it is important to know about different languages. So while they are learning different languages, they don't forget about whatever they have had. And as the person who has asked this correctly has made this comment, we will be finally ending up with boring society. As I said, there are more than 7,000 languages, half of them are dying. And then even if we try to forget about whatever we had, what we are remained with is a very boring society of humans. I mean, the whole world that only speak one or two or very few number of languages. And when languages die, the cultural factors die with them as well. So I suggest that we keep whatever we have as a new learner of a language as a newcomer, and try to practice it. Try not to lose it. This is nothing to be ashamed of or worried about. And at the same time, trying to learn the language of a country like Canada, and at the same time, trying to learn the culture. Not only does it hurt, but it also helps us to have a comparison. What are my similarities? What are the reference points that can help me to make connection with the host country?
Yeah, that's a great point on this question. And another question is really interesting. It asks about why English is so universal. For example, jobs such as aviation are very English focused. Is this because of the history of that British have had when it came to conquering land?
Yes, of course. This is something that is highly related to the history of humans when there was colonization times, and different European countries tried to colonize different parts of the world, and some of them were more prosperous than the others in conquering and colonizing other nations and other countries. So this is one of the reasons. There might be other reasons as well, but yes, this is something that it is as we have it nowadays, and yeah, that's the point.
Is there something to do with the grammar as well? Because usually what I hear from linguistics, people, they say that the English grammar is pretty easy relative to Turkish, let's say Chinese. Can it be something to do with like learning new grammar in a correct way?
It could be that, but imagine if a language, a Bantu language spoken in Africa with all its complexities would be the dominant language. People would learn it, and one of the reasons that we posit that English might be easier in terms of its grammar is that as we grow up, we all know that there's a language called English. We see the structures, we see the grammars. Everybody is learning English, so gradually the difficulties fade as we grow up. But that's the point as well, that relative to some languages, English grammar might be easier.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that. So the next question is, will it ever stop to translate English into my native language in my head?
Will it ever stop to translate English into my native language in my head? Yeah, this is one of the processes of learning a language. It's very much common. People, when they want to say something in English or in their non-native language, first they translate it into their processing system, into their own native language, and then turn it into English. It is very much possible to not think in your own native language and directly use your faculty of language, which has become that much proficient that you can say whatever you want without thinking about your native language. And that happens at a very high advanced levels, that without the use of your native language, you can quickly switch to English without any thought, and you can quickly improvise in English.
Yeah. Another question is that what advice would you have for someone who's starting to forget their mother language? Apart from trying to speak it more, are there other things that I can do?
Yeah. Besides speaking, I think we have to have a great deal of exposure. And if it's direct or indirect, that works. For instance, watching movies, listening to music that are in that specific language, that can be very much helpful. Reading literature is a very great way. Of course, for a person who has a lower level of education, who's probably a primary school student, it might be a little bit difficult to read literature, but we can find different books for different levels, age levels, and we can find some mitigation strategies. So film, music, literature, or anything that is fun for them if they are at a younger age.
Okay. So the next question is, does it make you sad to think of all the languages that are going to extinct? Me being a person who lives in Canada, I am accustomed to seeing First Nation languages die out, and it makes me feel sad to think that an entire culture is lost.
Yes, that's a very sad thing that's happening pretty much fast across the world. There are lots of linguists who are trying to revitalize languages, who are trying to document languages, and the University of Toronto Linguistics Department, as well as the Indigenous Studies, are one of the most important hubs in the world. I can say that they are trying to keep languages from dying. And as I said earlier, when one language dies, everything else related to that language, cultural backgrounds, literature, poetry, everything dies with that. So that's something that's happening. Unfortunately, it's going much very fast. As I said, 40% of the languages of the world are dying with less than 1,000 speakers left.
Yeah, and our last question, which is another interesting question, it says that does learning a new language can change our way of thinking, our perceptions?
Of course, the short answer is yes, because when we learn a new language, we start to get familiarized with the speakers of that language. It is important to, I'm not sure if I mentioned that or not, it is important to highlight the importance and significance of translation in this world that we are living in. But translation doesn't always help us. Whenever we learn a new language, we get into the depth of a society, the very much deeper levels and layers of the society that translation doesn't have access to. For example, when we want to learn something about Chinese culture, there are so many good translations about that. For instance, something about Chinese music. But when we learn the language, Mandarin, Cantonese, or any language that's talking about a specific field of music, something related to a very culture specific, if we don't know the language, we may not be able to perceive the way that the speakers of that language view that thing. Think of a food, think of something that like poetry, like literature. The way we view it as a translated work, a great deal of the things that we're talking about gets lost in the translation. As a result, the perception that we have is not a complete perception, obviously. So when we learn a new language, we're introduced into a new world and obviously a new way of thinking and perception.
Yeah. I'm really grateful that you came to our workshop. It's now 8 p.m. I don't want to hold anybody like more than they are promised. We can take more questions if you have time, but yes, thank you so much for coming to our workshop. We are gonna have our second workshop soon in 2 weeks. Yeah, we would like to see you all in there as well. I also want to thank you, Kirsch. It was an excellent presentation, and thank you for answering our questions for the last 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. That was a great pleasure for me. I know that there are so many other questions. I'm happy to stay, but I understand that there are limitations in terms of the time. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, this is very great to have such wonderful organizations. And importantly, having these organizations and keeping them alive is only possible with the dedication of wonderful volunteers like you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Karsh.
We have last 2 questions. If you want to answer those,
yeah, sure.
We can definitely go ahead. Okay. And I think audiences are liking our workshop. They are thanking you
Oh,
one.
thank you very much.
Okay. It asks that, do you think that the immigration departments in countries are doing enough to make English easier to learn within their own countries? Do you think that they are investing enough money to teaching people who don't understand English? Is there room to improve?
To answer your last question first, yes, there is always room to improve. I'm not sure if immigration departments are putting enough efforts or not, but I'm aware that there are great institutions such as the University of Toronto that invest a lot of human resources as well as financial resources in order to improve their education system, specifically for foreign language and second language learners. Research is in progress. I am aware that there are so many researchers at different levels of education, higher education, with different learners from different age ranges, trying to find the best ways in order to mitigate the strategies of language barrier, but there is always enough room for improvement.
And last but not least, we have, as known, there
I think she's having some technical problems, so I'm going to read it.
Yeah, please.
So as known, there is no end point in learning a language. At what level of learning English would it be better for someone to start learning another language, for instance, French?
Yeah, that's an important question. There are some ways that we can find when's the best time to learn a new language while we are learning the other one. My suggestion is that we can start learning a language like French in this case compared to English, is that we know how we are competent enough in English, so we'll have learned it enough and we have enough proficiency to communicate easily. And after that, I suggest we start learning French, because if we are not completely fluent or near fluent in English, then we switch to French, we might neither learn English perfectly well nor French. So in short, my suggestion is that we learn English at an acceptable rate and then try to learn French as well. And the case that you have brought up here is that I learned a little bit of French for a few semesters, and it was the time that I had enough proficiency in English, and that helped me very much. So when you learn English perfectly, after that, when you want to learn French, it helps you a lot. Your learning abilities skyrockets.
Thank you so much. This is all we got in terms of questions. Once again, thank you for coming to our workshop. It was an honor to have you as a guest in our workshop. Thank you. Good night.
Have a good one, everybody.